All right, hello and welcome to today's book talk where we're going to be discussing Dr. Jenna Jordan's book, Leadership Decapitation, Strategic Targeting of Terrorist Organizations. I'm Jess Regan, I'm the Program Specialist for Security, at the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology, which is also known as CSINT. We are co-sponsoring this event today with CSINT, which is an interdisciplinary research hub designed to address the wide-ranging impacts of new technology and non-traditional threats, and is committed to a balanced forward-thinking approach regarding future impacts of technology across a broad spectrum of fields, and the Political Violence and Security Research Cluster here at AU, which aims to bring together faculty and PhD students with an intellectual and research focus on understanding the causes of consequences of the violent political behavior of states, non-state actors, and individuals across, between, and within formal political boundaries. So today we have with us Dr. Jenna Jordan and American's own Professor Audrey Kurth Cronin, who is going to be moderating today's event. Unfortunately, Professor Joe Young had an unavoidable conflict this morning that's keeping him from participating in today's event, but he has participated by providing some thoughtful and very conversationally evoking questions to Professor Cronin. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the program to Professor Cronin for a proper introduction of our guest speaker. All right.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to Jenna Jordan. Let me tell you a little bit about her. So this is a book launch for her excellent study. Let me show it to you. Leadership Decapitation, Strategic Targeting of Terrorist Organizations, which was just published by Stanford University Press. Great book, recommended highly. Today's event, as you know, is jointly sponsored by the Political Violence Cluster and by CSINT, both at the School of International Service of American University in Washington, D.C. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce Jenna Jordan. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago, her MA from Stanford University, and her BA from Mills College in Oakland, California. Professor Jordan has also held postdoctoral research fellowships at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy Studies. And currently, she is Associate Professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia, where on top of being a brilliant researcher and writer, she's also an award-winning teacher. And Dr. Jordan is currently Director of Graduate Studies, which we all know is both a crucial position for any university and a lot of hard work. So Professor Jordan is an exemplar to all of us for her dedication to her students, her university, and her scholarship. Anyway, we're here to learn today about and also to celebrate her brand new book on leadership decapitation as a tactic of counterterrorism. So I'll turn things over to Professor Jordan for an overview of the book's arguments first. Jenna?
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the very kind introduction. And I have to just tell everyone that I have been really inspired by Dr. Cronin's work for a long time. And I've always really looked up to you. So thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate it. All right, so I'm going to share my screen and let's just get this 1 minute. Okay, so do you just see my slides here?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, great. So I'm just going to talk for about 20-25 minutes and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I look forward to what everyone has to their comments and questions. So here we have Osama bin Laden, excuse me, leader of Al-Qaeda, killed in a raid May 2nd, 2011 in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Anwar al-Awlaki, he was an American, as we know. He was a senior leader, a recruiter for Al-Qaeda, and was killed in 2011 by a US drone strike in Yemen. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, killed in 2006 by a US airstrike in Iraq. Here were two leaders of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Abdelaziz Rentizi, both a spiritual and founder and spiritual leader of Hamas and a more operational political leader, both killed in 2004 by Israeli Hellfire missiles in Gaza City. Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who's a senior leader of ISIS, a spokesperson, killed by a drone strike in Aleppo, Syria, and he was very influential in overseeing the recruitment of foreign fighters. Here we have some older cases. This is Abimael Guzman. He was the founder and leader of Shining Path, captured in 1992 in Lima by Peruvian authorities. And pictures of Guzman like this in a tiger cage in a striped prison attire were widely broadcasted in the aftermath. And this was really a demoralizing and kind of humiliating blow to both Guzman and to the organization. And this is often seen as the beginning of the decline of Shining Path. Yet the organization still continued to carry out terrorist attacks. And he was replaced by Oscar Durand, who continued to lead a weakened but a still active organization. Here we have Abdullah Öcalan, leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, arrested in Kenya in 1999 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, there was obviously considerable decline in activity after his arrest. His followers continued their campaign, however, in spite of his repeated calls for renunciation of violence. And as we know, the PKK has sort of resurged and resurfaced and is still active today. And finally, we have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leader of ISIS, killed in a raid in Syria in October. So I show all these cases really to demonstrate that all of these instances of very high profile targeting efforts were really unsuccessful. And so that was what inspired this topic, was that, you know, for so long, targeting leaders was seen as a, kind of silver bullet, or at least a really influential means of weakening and degrading an organization's operational capabilities. And so I thought, well, if all of these incredibly high profile cases still saw active organizations in the aftermath, what accounts for this variation? So that was kind of what inspired the project. So here we have a chart that shows leadership targeting over time. So this shows the increase. You can see the increase in the number of attacks against terrorist leaders from 1970 to 2016. And the blue signifies arrests of leaders and the red signifies death. And actually, that's just an important point. When I say decapitation, I'm referring to both arrests and killings of terrorist leaders. And in fact, targeting leaders was actually listed first in the 2006 National Strategy for Combating Terrorism Priorities of Action. And leadership targeting has been and remains to be a central feature of contemporary US counterterrorism policy. Now, the 2006 document was interesting. It was kind of framed in terms of addressing a much broader ideological threat. Then fast forward to 2011, and the document focused less on a strategy of regime change, as we saw in the aftermath of the war in Iraq and subsequent operations in the region, and emphasized the importance of undermining a group's, and Al-Qaeda specifically, operational capacity. And the document really presented a broader approach toward eliminating the threat of terrorism through weakening and disrupting and degrading Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Now, the document is interesting in that it doesn't highlight the tactical choices really necessary to achieve the broader goals, but it did emphasize the fact that US efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which were really not exclusively targeting leaders, but that was obviously a huge part of it, of the overall efforts. And the argument was that these efforts really destroyed much of the organization's leaderships and weakened the organization. And the document was released just after the death of Osama bin Laden, and argued that in the aftermath, we saw the group struggling and facing significant organizational challenges, likely undermining its ability to adapt and evolve. Now, this slide shows the instances of decapitation against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates from 1995 to 2006. And then this following slide shows Al-Qaeda attacks from 1992 to 2015. And the reason I show this chart is just to sort of, just kind of visually capture the fact that, obviously we saw significant efforts targeting Al-Qaeda leaders, but then we also see, considerable increases in attacks, at least for certain affiliates over time, that have been the recipients of repeated targeting efforts. And so that sort of brings me to the puzzle that I mentioned earlier. and kind of the questions that I ask in the book, which is, why do some groups persist while others collapse after facing leadership targeting? When is leadership decapitation effective? Right? This is not to say that it never works. Sometimes it has been an effective strategy. So I want to understand when and why that is. And then what makes an organization more or less resilient to destabilization through targeting efforts. So I just want to say a few words about the theoretical model or theoretical arguments that I propose in the book, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the statistical findings, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So basically, to account for variation and why decapitation works sometimes and why it doesn't work other times, I argue that a group's susceptibility is a function of three factors: organizational structure, popular or communal support, and ideology, which I really sort of use as a way of talking about group type. And so what I argue in a nutshell is that leadership decapitation is unlikely to result in the demise or really even significant decline in activity in groups that are highly bureaucratized, have high levels of popular support, or are driven by a more religious or separatist ideology. And the argument is that leaders matter less under these conditions, and that under these conditions, their removal can often have adverse consequences, such as retaliatory attacks or increase in the frequency of attacks in the aftermath of decapitation. So I'm going to just go through the three different arguments. So the first argument is about bureaucracy. And basically, the idea is that groups that are bureaucratized are going to be more in a better position to withstand targeting efforts. And bureaucratization is basically an internal mechanism that increases the stability of a group and facilitates clear succession processes. Bureaucratized groups are diversified. They have a clear division of administrative responsibility and functions. They can provide organizational redundancy. They have standard operating procedures, succession mechanisms, all of these things that minimize disruption. And another important point is that bureaucracies tend to be not just more efficient. Now, obviously, we can sidestep arguments about the pathologies of bureaucracies, which we know are there. But they do tend toward efficiency, and they're often seen as more legitimate in the eyes of local communities, which is an important point as well. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. But they're characterized in part by the development of these stable routines, rules, but then also reliability and accountability. And what I do when I look at the data is I sort of hypothesize that small groups and younger groups are going to be less likely to be bureaucratized, and that these are the groups that we see more susceptible to leadership targeting efforts, to destabilization in the wake of leadership targeting, whereas older groups and larger groups tend to in order to just effectively manage the organizational complexity facing larger groups or groups that have been around for a long time, that these groups tend to bureaucratize and will thus be more stable and more easily or less easily weakened in the aftermath. Interesting, though, is that older and larger groups also tend to become more decentralized. And so people often think about bureaucracy and decentralization as kind of opposites, but I actually don't think that's the case. I think that you can have groups that are kind of bureaucratized at the upper levels of the administration, kind of hierarchical, but then at the lower operational levels tend to be more decentralized. And it's these quasi kind of bureaucracies that I think are quite stable. The next factor I look at is communal support. And basically, groups depend upon support from their communities or their communities just to get basic access to resources, right? Things that groups need to operate and survive. Think about groups and what do terrorist groups need, right? They need members, they need people, so they need to recruit, they need money, they need resources, they need things like safe houses, right? And to ensure their ability to operate as a covert organization. And so this kind of support can provide information, resources, attract recruits, and help groups to operate covertly a little bit more. And so things that we might see for groups that tend to have a lot of support might be things like local infrastructure, a higher societal tolerance for violence, heavy-handed counterterrorism policies. Things like that might signal that groups are able to operate in ways that give them more support, right? Even at a basic level, providing social services is something groups do that can help, sort of strengthen that support on the ground. The final factor I want to talk about is ideology. And for this project, I classify groups as either religious or Islamist or separatist, right-wing, left-wing, or some combination. Obviously, some groups, have two different types of orientation. But what I sort of hypothesize is that religious and separatist groups should be more difficult to destabilize by targeting their leaders. And the reason why is that, while these groups, well, this actually ties in an interesting way with communal support, is that oftentimes, separatist groups tend to represent maybe not the entire view of a community in which they're operating, but perhaps a sizable majority of the people, agree with maybe not the tactics, but at least the overall goals of autonomy or independence or whatever it might be. And religious organizations as well, right? They tend to emerge from the communities in which the groups are developing and growing. But I think more importantly is that these groups tend not to depend upon their leadership for the coherence of the ideological doctrine, right? Is that the leaders in these cases often go to great lengths to make sure that the ideology is well entrenched beyond the organization. Bin Laden made great efforts to kind of really make sure that the ideological resonance of Al-Qaeda would actually, withstand beyond his death. And I think we see the same thing with separatist organizations as well. The ideology is not dependent upon a particular articulation of a leader. Whereas some of the sort of leftist, Marxist-Leninist organizations that we saw operating in Latin America and Western Europe tended to be based upon a leader's particular articulation of that ideology. And I think that's what makes leadership more important in those ways, is that the ideology is dependent upon the particular, doctrine and rhetoric of a leader. So those are kind of, I don't want to go into too much detail. I have to see, I don't want to go over time too much, but those are some of the basic arguments. And so the susceptibility of organizations to decapitation should really vary based on organizational type. And so I'll talk about some of these findings in just a minute. So I looked at a few different independent variables. I looked at a group's age. I looked at size, which I talked about when I mentioned bureaucracy. So these were sort of my ways of getting at organizational structure, right? Sort of proxies for that. Ideally, I would have been able to have a data set that coded, the organizational structure of every hundreds of groups in the data set, but sadly, that data is not always easy to come by. So I used these as proxies. And then in the case studies, I looked a little bit more in depth at some of the organizational structure. And then I also categorized whether groups were religious, separatist, right-wing, left-wing, Islamist. I looked at the leader's position within the hierarchy of leadership. So while I was looking at leaders specifically, I didn't just focus on top leaders. I looked at members of the upper echelon, people that held higher levels of authority within the organization. I looked at whether leaders were arrested or killed, and then I looked at a couple variables for the states in which the organizations primarily operated. I looked at GDP, population, regime type, as some other kind of control variables. So I then had to figure out my dependent variable, right? For lack of a better term, I had to figure out what is it that I'm trying to explain? How do I look at the efficacy of counterterrorism policies? And, whenever I teach this to my class, I always, realize it's a challenge, right? To figure out how do you measure how effective a counterterrorism policy is? What sorts of things do you look at? There's a lot of different ways you could go about evaluating it. But I, for the sake of this project, really focused on organizational activity. I looked at the frequency of attacks. I looked at the number of attacks groups were carrying out. But then I also looked at a group's kind of lifespan or survival rate or how long they lasted. So those were sort of the two different things I looked at. And so basically, kind of in a nutshell, and I'll go through these sort of three different measures that you see up here on the slide right now. Just looking at organizational activity, and what I did was I actually looked at whether or not a group carried out activity in 1 year following an instance of decapitation, 2 years, and then 5 years. So I looked at these sort of different bins to see if a group was active in these particular periods of time. Originally, in my earlier version of this, I just looked at 2 years, and I sort of did this because I'm interested in having policy implications for the kind of work I do when thinking about counterterrorism and thinking about counterterrorism policy specifically. And the State Department redesignates terrorist groups every couple years, and so I thought the 2 years seemed a reasonable measure. But then I actually took some flack, right? And people said, well, actually, that's a pretty high bar, right? To think that a group is not going to carry out activity for 2 years. Aren't there smaller, more nuanced measures that if you were a policymaker, you might look at to see if a group is actually, been weakened or degraded. So that's why I wanted to look at lifespan. But then I looked at a 1 year period as well. But then I also looked at the frequency of attacks in the aftermath of decapitation to see if that might have an impact. So I tried to provide a more nuanced account. But looking at organizational activity, I found that basically larger groups, older groups, Islamist groups, and separatist groups were less likely to experience a decline in activity than other groups. And actually, against the most active organizations, the groups that were carrying out the most amount of activity, decapitation actually resulted in an increase in activity. I also found that organizations in more autocratic countries or those with a higher GDP also had a higher rate of a decline in activity. And so what I kind of take this to mean is that, right, while decapitation can be effective in certain cases, overall, I kind of argue that it's not going to significantly hinder the activity of these particular organizations or bring about its demise. And the findings were similar when I looked across these other variables as well. So looking at the frequency of attacks, I used like a transition matrix analysis as a way to get at the probability of groups having an increasing rate of attacks in the aftermath of decapitation or decreasing. And what I found is that decapitated groups were actually more likely to have an increase in attacks than the non-decapitated groups. And that kind of points to a sort of counterproductiveness in a way of decapitation. But what's interesting there is that that probability depends on a group's prior level of activity. So if a group already saw an increasing level of activity, then you're more likely to see that increasing. So you do see some variation. But again, those results also held the most true for these larger, older Islamist and separatist groups. And finally, the data on organizational survival was interesting in that I basically found it to be a sort of non-statistically significant relationship. So I didn't find that decapitation decreased or increased the survival rate of an organization, its overall mortality rate. But then when I looked at certain certain features, then I found, that these certain kinds of organizations I mentioned tended to have a, higher survival rate over time after decapitation. And then I just want to end with a couple thoughts. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a chart I had for my survival rate. I can always go back to that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the adverse consequences. And I think this is an important thing to think about is that, oftentimes in the aftermath of decapitation, we see calls for, revenge, calls for retaliation to avenge a particular leader's death. And this is not an uncommon thing that happens. And I think that people can understand that because on the other side, right, countries who are targets of terrorist attacks tend to be motivated by this desire for retribution and justice, right? We can think about in the aftermath of bin Laden's death, we saw people, right, cheering outside of the White House. And of course, right, this was, you know, someone that had committed murderous acts, right? But that sense of revenge is actually quite interesting. And so many people that have written about decapitation have said, well, you know, even if it's not an effective policy, perhaps states should continue using it. Well, why might that be? Well, publics like to be reassured, right? We want to know that our state is carrying out effective counterterrorism policies to keep us safe. And, you know, there's an interesting argument that I always found great by Professor Ethan Bueno de Mesquita at the Public Policy School at Chicago. And he talked about observable versus unobservable measures of counterterrorism policies. And that, you know, maybe some of the observable measures are actually not as effective, but they're things that people see and make them feel safer, right? So there's that interesting dynamic about that sort of sense of justice and revenge, but it goes in both ways. But back to the consequences, we can also think about it, you know, increasing sympathy for an organization and recruitment, increasing radicalization, groups learn and adapt, right? Or even, as I mentioned, right, seeing an increase in attacks. This is an important way for groups to signal we're not weakened, right? We're not impacted by this attack. We can still operate. And so these are the kinds of things that you might see in the aftermath. So those are some of the implications that I sort of think are important to consider when we talk about it. I will stop there. I'm sorry I went over just a couple minutes, but I look forward to your comments. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see people. Wait, no, it won't. Okay, stop share. Great. There we go. Thank you for listening.
It's been a pleasure. And thank you so much. Very nuanced, very interesting presentation. Jenna, I'm going to take the privilege of being in the chair position to ask you a few questions before I turn things over to the audience. I promise not to go on too long, audience, so get your questions in there. I want to start, are you there?
Grabbing a pen.
Oh, Jenna, we've lost you. All right, I want to start with the narrow and the specific, not because these are the more important questions, but while your presentation is still very fresh on our minds, when you looked at bureaucracy, the first of the factors that you say are important to the ability to survive decapitation, did you also, you've hinted about this, but can you expand upon the question of whether a bureaucracy is hierarchical versus networked? I mean, you've talked about age and so forth, but a lot of work is focused on that element. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, you know, I always wish that I could have gone into greater detail in this in the book. I actually, a couple years ago, started getting a little bit into network analysis, which I think is like a fascinating tool for understanding the dynamics of terrorist groups and how people operate and communicate.
Popular too, actually. So.
Yeah, definitely. But so it's interesting because I might even have used the word networked in my book, but really we could think about a network as having all different kinds of structures. So a network can be hierarchical, a network can be decentralized, a network can be, you know, the sort of star and spoke model where you have one in the middle and people, you know, communicating that way. So I didn't really look at, you know, a bunch of different organizational structures per se. I didn't look at a bunch of different types of networks, except to say that, you know, the decentralized network, which we know that terrorist groups, especially in the kind of post 9/11 world, right? We saw groups increasingly developing these kind of decentralized structures because I think, you know, groups learn that these are harder to penetrate. If you have, you know, these groups that are disconnected in a lot of ways, it becomes much harder for counterterrorism forces to really like infiltrate in some way. So I sort of pose bureaucracy as a way of understanding the governance, for lack of a better word, I think, of an organization and how it handles its operations. And then decentralized as more of an operational level. But groups can kind of have both. So at that upper level, to have that hierarchical administrative function, and then this operational level decentralized, I think it's this combination that's like those are the strong groups. You know, groups like Hamas has this, you know, and they've obviously been really effective at withstanding leadership targeting efforts over the years, so.
Yeah. Okay. So network analysis is really popular. And actually, I always find it funny because network analysis can go back to the 19th century. It's not something new, but anyway, okay, that makes sense. So the other narrow question I wanted to ask you is about the other two aspects, the fact that groups are communal, and also you identified certain ideologies as being more or less susceptible. Aren't those two really overlapping? Because communal, an ideology of religion is related automatically to a community that is of that religion. And the same is the case for ethno-national separatists, by definition related to an ethnicity or a nation, or sometimes a territory. So how do you distinguish between those two?
Yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head with that one. That was actually something I really struggled with. And so in the statistical analysis, I kept those distinct. I didn't have, a way to measure communal support because they were so totally integrated in a lot of ways. So theoretically, it was something I struggled with because they are totally related, particularly when you're thinking about ideology, right? Like what makes a separatist group and a religious group, when I'm looking at ideology, more resilient, a lot of it has to do with the support that they're getting from their communities on the ground. But there is another factor that I did see as distinct, and that was the reason I kind of parsed them out theoretically, was that idea about what is the role that the leader plays itself. And so when you're looking at the ideological factor, the fact that the group doesn't depend upon the leadership for the rearticulation of its ideology, I think that's more what I see as the distinct argument from ideology. But you're right. That said, I mean, ultimately, when we're thinking about, the difference between separatist groups and religious groups beyond that distinct ideology, even when you're in, and this is where I think I do struggle, is that even when you're thinking about the ideology, like why a particular ideology isn't dependent upon its leadership for its articulation, well, because it's present in the communities. So you're right. It's really hard to disentangle them. And so, when I looked in the cases, I tried to look at distinct things, right? For support, I sort of use them as a way, like, well, let's identify what's going on in these organizations. So I looked at things like public opinion polls. And then when I looked at ideology, I looked at, what were some of the what specific ideology of the leader, and how did the leader, participate in really entrenching the ideology and making it withstand its, the life of this particular individual. So that was how I did it in practice. But conceptually, it's really hard to distinguish them. You're right.
That makes sense, though, to distinguish them according to the role of the leader. So I have one more narrow question and then one big question, and then I'll turn it over to everybody else. So, on the narrow question, you start in 1970, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that you would have had a different set of outcomes, or would you have any idea as to how things might have come out differently if you'd had a broader time range?
Yeah. I wanted to initially.
It's very hard, and there are no good, databases. So this is not a criticism. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I mean, it is interesting, right? I'm sure we both teach courses on terrorism, and whenever you go and, read a particular empirical study, I always look at the time period that, it's representing, because obviously that's going to influence, right? If a study stops at 2002 versus 2020, you're going to get like totally different results. But it's funny, I actually hadn't really given much thought to, like, if I brought it back to, say, I don't know, to capture like kamikaze pilots, right? Like, would those cases have been included? I think because the non-state actor phenomenon perhaps wasn't as prolific as it is now, maybe it would be a different, the set of cases that I would have to consider would be fundamentally different. I'm not sure. I have to think about that more. That's a really good question.
Well, that may have been an unfair question, because I just wrote a book on this. So, it starts in the 19th century. And I'm thinking to myself, how would Jenna Jordan's theory work for the anarchists? Or how would they work, in the 1930s? Well, we had a lot of right-wing terrorism as well as, state-sponsored violence. But so anyway, I just made my wheels spin a little, and I was just curious as to what you.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Whenever I teach, I just taught recently, I sort of was trying to tell my students, here's the whole history of terrorism. Let's go back to the French Revolution. But I did not apply that to my own research. But you're right, it's a great question. Thinking, because all the different waves and what the arguments have been different during the different periods of time, right? The colonial period and the anarchist period, how does leadership function in those different time periods?
Exactly. And so one of the things I'm worried about moving forward is whether we're getting toward the end of a wave, and the only way you can see what's going to happen in the future is to look a little further, open the aperture a little bigger historically to see what we might be looking at. It could be that terrorism between 1970 and the present has some elements of anomaly.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that's
it. We have to talk about that more. That's interesting.
Okay. Last question, and then I'll let everybody in. So the United States has transitioned so much towards special operations, drones, these types of tactics. And what I find is that a lot of the same people who are in favor of those tactics also argue that the terrorist threat in general, Islamist particularly, is increasing. So why is that? Why do we have that disconnect between what you're saying is the outcomes of these types of tactics and what our broader policy is? You've given us some sense of that, but do you have any further comments on it?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is a disconnect. That's, in terms of, I'm going to actually not directly answer the question yet, and then I'll come back to it. But, in terms of, people say, well, if targeting doesn't work, what do we do, right? What's the alternative? And obviously things like, full military occupation, boots on the ground have, not only not really been effective, but as we've seen, at least specifically in the case of terrorism, have, led to more resilient, stronger, right, more funded, more supported organizations. So obviously, the use of drones, targeted operations, special operations forces is going to have, a smaller footprint, result in less kind of conflict, right? Less loss of American lives, people going in and actually operating. And so there's, and perhaps too, there's the argument that these more targeted operations do result in less, widespread opposition to, counterterrorism operations, right? Maybe targeting leaders is a little bit, is going to result in a less kind of counterproductive consequences than going in and having a full scale kind of military intervention. That said, if we're looking just at the sheer numbers, then what do we do, right? Because this isn't a truly effective strategy as well. So one thing, and this gets back to the question of thinking about this particular kind of terrorism that we're sort of tend to be seen as what the US is focusing on countering these days, is thinking about a range of counterterrorism policies, right? And maybe there's a range of policies that are really coercive on one end, right? Really heavy-handed on the use of force, and then maybe really conciliatory on the other end. And so kind of figuring out where in that continuum policies tend to be more effective. And so maybe the more conciliatory, right, counter-ideological, disengagement type of programs, right? Maybe these are more effective against the kinds of terrorism that we're dealing with now than maybe, than targeting leaders was in the 70s or in the 60s or in the 50s or in the 80s. So that's one thing I would love to actually sort of look at that more broadly, is really comparing the efficacy of different kinds of counterterrorism policies, thinking about their level of coerciveness or conciliatory approaches. So
that's very interesting. All right. Well, Dr. Jordan, we will turn to some of the questions from the audience. The first one is asking, how do you see policy changing in an age of leaderless resistance among both fundamentalist Islamist terrorist group and white nationalist or right-wing groups? So I think that you've touched on the answer to this question already somewhat, but maybe you could address this question of what about right-wing, the resurgence of right-wing terrorism? How does your theory impact that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky too, right? And particularly with this sort of leaderless resistance, where you have organizations that are, recruiting people online and kind of trying to inspire people, really, not from a sort of top-down leader-driven model. And I think we're seeing that more and more. And obviously groups like ISIS, right, are still utilizing, online encrypted platforms and things like that as a way to really kind of get people involved and get people, wanting to participate. So as far as what does my theory, speaks to that. And when you're thinking about ideology, right, and the ideological resonance, and I think that's something important to think about. So, Adnani, who was, the ISIS spokesperson, who actually, like, not long before he was killed, he said something like, you can, this isn't directly related to leaders' resistance, but the idea of ideology, I promise I'll make this point work. So he talks about, how you can take away our territory, right? Because as we know, ISIS was losing a considerable amount of territory and getting pushed back, right? And getting sort of more and more weakened. He said, okay, you could take away all of this, but you can't take away our ideology, right? And the fact that, we will regroup, right? We'll kind of, retrench a little bit, we'll regroup and we'll come back. Or maybe we'll operate more as like an asymmetric kind of guerrilla warfare rather than a state-like entity with, strong governance institutions and things like that. So I think so that points to the resonance of ideology, right? And I think that's what we're seeing now in this particular model, is that ideology is an incredibly motivating and incredibly, inspiring kind of way. So what do we do about that? Well, maybe that's the next project.
Yes.
I don't have an answer yet.
Well, yeah, the good news is there's always so much more research to do.
Exactly.
Okay, fair enough. Jenna, let's see. Do groups ever operate more effectively without a leader? Someone asks.
Well, I guess you'd have to go back and think, well, what does that mean to operate effectively, right? That's kind of the first thing we'd have to think about. Well, what do we mean by that? Do we mean, are they able to recruit and get a lot of people? Maybe, right? There's interesting models that come out of, organizational theorists, right? Organizational theorists are great at asking the question of how do you get people to participate, particularly when you're facing collective action problems, and, maybe you can get the benefits of the group without actually going out and like having to carry out terrorist attacks and kill people and things like that. So how do you motivate people to get involved? And so there's this idea of incentives, right? Providing selective incentives. And so that's one of the arguments that people often make for why leaders matter, is that leaders can provide selective incentives, right? Whether they're monetary or whether they're spiritual and things like that. But as we now know, right, in the age of like the internet and social media, people can get these kinds of non-material incentives, right? Feeling part of a group, just by communicating with people online, right? As we're all seeing right now, right? My social life is happening on the computer these days, and I'm benefiting from it, right? I'm getting something out of it. So if we're thinking about recruitment, maybe now we're seeing a different model, right? Maybe groups are really able to use this effectively. Maybe leaders matter at some point in the organization's lifespan, right? To really develop a coherent movement and a strong ideology. And once they get that going, maybe they matter less. So maybe it's a period of time, right? A kind of evolutionary process. So I think you have to think about where in and that really comes to an issue of thinking about not just an organization, right? But a social movement, right? The larger movement for which groups are operating on behalf of, right? Groups are trying to do something. And often we see lots of different groups trying to do the same thing. And so maybe we need to think about it as a social movement, and there's different points within the life of a movement where leaders matter more or less. Mm-hmm. So
that's really very interesting, because there's so much rich research done on social movements, and it's very hard to get the social movement folks to talk to the terrorism and counterterrorism folks, because they're very different in sort of what they're looking for. And yet there are overlaps. When does a movement turn into violence, and when does a violent movement become more oriented toward productive uses of their energy? So yeah, I wish we would work more together.
I agree. I've been thinking about this so much more recently, especially with like the kind of, sort of right-wing violence and this kind of like leaderless stuff that we're seeing in our country right now. And even, QAnon, I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but, is this all part of a broader social movement that's happening? And so I've been, I agree with you. I think the social movement literature is so rich. And then they also, get at these organizational dynamics as well that matter. So it's really, I think it's a shame there isn't more interaction between these bodies of work.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, now we have a question about Boko Haram.
Oh.
I think this is someone who may be doing research on Boko Haram. I don't actually have the name of some of the questioners, but is there anything significant in your findings or any general observations from your research that are relevant to Boko Haram?
To be fair, in all honesty, I haven't looked in great detail at Boko Haram, so I don't really know the organizational dynamics, that much. I would say, broadly thinking about ideology, right? I would say that the theory would predict that it's not likely to have much impact. When thinking about support, I don't know how much support the organization has on the ground, perhaps in terms of thinking about, provision of, services in some way that, the state is often unable to do. I think that might be a factor there. But that's actually one case I've always felt bad that I haven't looked at more in depth. So I apologize, I don't have a richer answer to that. But just looking at the basic variables, I would say the theory would predict not likely to have a lot of impact on the group's operational capacity. So,
well, that's helpful information. Perhaps this person will be doing that research, and then we can invite that person. I don't have a name, so anonymous person, good luck with the Boko Haram research. Here's a question that I do have a name from, Boaz Atzili.
Oh, hi, Boaz.
Boaz. I'll actually read the question rather than garble it. Is efficacy dependent at all on the character of the leader? For instance, Hezbollah became much stronger under a new leadership after decapitation, while Al-Qaeda seems to be struggling under a less charismatic leader after bin Laden's decapitation.
That is an excellent question. Yeah, those are two really like strong examples where, Hezbollah and ISIS for sure. It's interesting because when I started this project, I really was like wanting to challenge the kind of charismatic theories of leadership. And so the idea was that, terrorist leaders tend to be charismatic kind of across the board. And so, even going back to thinking about Weber and like different bases for authority. And so the idea that the charismatic basis of authority is very fragile, right? And so groups that are based on this are much more easily weakened. And I really wanted to kind of challenge that model because I thought, well, okay, that might be true in some cases, but not, we don't see, if all terrorist leaders were sort of charismatic in some ways, then you would see it across the board, right? And so that was sort of my starting point. But then you bring up what I think is the right point, is that charisma does vary, right? And some leaders have more charisma than others. So what that looks like is harder to, it's kind of like, well, you sort of know it when you see it, right? Like, how do we understand charisma? Well, some people say, okay, charisma is like this supernatural kind of characteristics that people imbue upon their leadership. So it's almost like undescribable in some way, but we know it when we see it, right? Certain people just tend to be more charismatic than others. So then I thought, okay, well, maybe it has to do with the function of that particular individual. Do they occupy more of an organizational or more of a spiritual function? Michael Freeman has written some great stuff on this, where he's looked at the kind of different function of the leader. So maybe that helps get us closer to the answer. Brian Price has kind of looked at this as well, right? Leaders that have organizations that are sort of more kind of value-based or different type, he kind of touches on this as well. So in short, I think the answer is yes, right? I think that there is something about the character of the leader that matters. I haven't looked at it because I focused more really on the organization itself. So I haven't, I looked at whether the leader was like a top leader or a member of the upper echelon or kind of like a lower level, military commander or whatever it might be. But I didn't look at that character of the leader. And I regret that I was so easily dismissed that when I first started studying that, because, maybe you just get older and wiser, and, and I realize it does matter, right? It is an influential factor. I mean, bin Laden was like a more dynamic, put himself out there more character than Zawahiri, and we see that. But so I'm sorry, it's kind of a meandering answer to your question, Boaz, which is a really great one.
Well, it's hard to put the character of a leader into a sort of quantitative model, or to measure it with a kind of a variable that might work in many political science projects. It's a little bit like, why do we have so many more projects that are on Congress rather than on the presidency when it comes to, American political science domestically? Because it's easier to measure what's going on in Congress. The presidency is more, dependent upon the individual. Yeah. So I think it's just a lot harder to measure too.
But it is important too. I mean, we're thinking about groups getting support, right? And how do you, when we go back to that argument about thinking about the evolution of a social movement and when leaders matter, I mean, as we know, right, thinking back, like certain kinds of leaders just were really able to like capture the attention of the public. I mean, obviously sometimes they did it in really coercive ways, but in other times they didn't, right? They had something dynamic.
Yeah, very interesting, I think, in the history of terrorism research, because there was so much focus on the leader from the 60s until maybe the mid 80s, or maybe even into the 90s. And now it's considered, sort of novel and new if you talk about the character of the leader. So it's kind of funny. All right, I want to give Joe Young a chance. His questions have informed some of my questions, but I will read one of the questions that he has here. Let's see. Is there a group today that keeps you up at night? What do you think would happen if they were targeted with leadership decapitation?
Well, ISIS used to actually keep me up at night. I used to really worry about ISIS a lot. They've kind of like, I don't worry as much about ISIS, for lack of a better term, but in terms of decapitation, right? I don't think that it was Baghdadi's death that's like really, weakened the organization, right? I think it was like concerted efforts to, push the group back in territory, right? Obviously we had help from, allies in, southern Turkey and northern Syria and things like that. So there, so there's that dimension. But I don't think that my ability to sleep at night was not due to decapitation. Let's see, other groups I worry about. Now I worry about everything going on in our country, right? And all the sort of like fringe groups and what's going on and the dissent and not even for thinking about being vulnerable to attacks, right? Like, I don't think I'm going to get, targeted with a terrorist attack, but I do worry about the safety of, marginalized groups in our society. And, I worry about the stability of our democratic regime and things like that. And it's so interesting because when I first started going into studying terrorism, I did not think about domestic terrorism at all. Right? Like, in fact, I was like, I don't study domestic terrorism. I only study transnational, terrorism, things happening abroad. And now I've really come to realize I need to understand domestic terrorism. I need to understand what's going on here because it's a whole nother movement. And maybe the dynamics and the models that we've been, that I've been studying for the last, however many years, 15 years, don't apply to what we're dealing with now. And I'm not sure. So those are the things I worry about now, is what's sort of going on in our country.
Yeah. And Martha Crenshaw was way out ahead on this. She was always arguing decades ago that we're ignoring domestic terrorism and all of the databases are not appropriately counting it all. And it's really come back to be extremely obvious for us now and the problems that we're facing domestically.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think I have time to ask one more brief question, and then I want to give you about 3 minutes to wrap up.
Okay.
So my impression in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so is that far more people in the field, especially political scientists, are writing about the efficacy of decapitation. I mean, there've been a tremendous number of articles. So why is that? What can you characterize a little bit about the other side of the argument and how it relates to the work that you've been doing?
Yeah. So do you mean like why have people just been focusing on efficacy as sort of at the expense of other issues related to?
No, I misspoke. I mean, why are there more people, at least in my opinion, and I could be wrong, Jenna, who seem to argue that decapitation is effective in many situations? I probably put it badly, but I really was surprised to see the flood of research that came out on that between about, I don't know, 2010 and the present.
Yeah. So it's a great question, right? Most people that study this totally disagree with me.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Me.
It's okay. I got like broad shoulders from studying at Chicago. I feel like I could take a lot of criticism, but yeah, I think so. It's something actually you touched on earlier about data sets, right? And like the time periods in which things are bounded. And so a lot of the work that some of the other studies that I have, talked about in my research end earlier than mine. So I'm wondering if there's something about this kind of like, post 2002 onward time period that, decapitation has been less effective, right? Think about the groups that we've been targeting from, 9/11 on, right? Most of these are larger, right? Older, religious, separatist, right? The kinds of organizations that I find that, tend to be kind of ineffective. And so maybe that's part of it. It's just a data issue. And I think another part of it has to do with how we measure efficacy, right? That goes back to something we talked about as well. I think people all look at efficacy in different ways. Additionally, some of the studies are focused more on specific regions,
yes,
or specific tools, right? Using drone strikes as a tool of targeting leaders. And so then that is why I think we're likely to see some other results as well. So I see those as the main reasons. But even part of it too is like, how do you count? And this is another thing that I felt like I always discounted for so many years, is like, what constitutes a terrorist organization? And everyone's like, oh, we know what a terrorist organization is. Let's stop talking about it already, And the more like I teach, the more often I teach the terrorism class, the more often I realize like how important this issue actually is, and how we even count the actual like what what we're even trying to analyze, right? And that people can include insurgent organizations or not, right? Or are we thinking about just groups that are insurgent that employ terrorism, or groups that are we're going to include all the small, I include a whole range of groups, right? I include groups that would be seen as insurgent and non-insurgent organizations, but they employ terrorism as a tactic, right? So that I think has to do with things as well, right? Is thinking about the groups that we're including in our data set vary. So I think all of those factors, I try to understand why that is. And those are my sort of go-to answers in my head when I think about this often.
Excellent. Okay, well, we have literally 2 minutes left.
Okay.
And I want to give you a chance to give us any last minute observations, last comments.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate your comments and taking the time to look at the book and read it. I'm incredibly grateful. And thank you all for hosting me and having me here. This has been a great opportunity. Even though I can't see you, it's comforting to know there are people out there. And so, so I just appreciate the great comments. And one reason I love doing these things is it's exciting, because it gets me inspired to think about new ways of approaching this issue and approaching counterterrorism broadly. So, as Dr. Cronin was saying how the importance of thinking about social movements, or the importance of thinking about domestic terrorism. It's nice for me to have this opportunity to kind of remind myself, like, let's go out, and there's work to be done, right? There's so many great research projects out there. You know, for those of you that are studying terrorism, and graduate students and undergrads, right? There's lots of great questions out there that still need to be answered. So, so it's an exciting field, and it's an important field. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find my email online. I always love talking to students, even students at other universities. So, so I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Jordan. We've really enjoyed your presentation, and you've inspired us. So we wish you the very best of luck and success with your future research, and we're very eager to go out and get a copy of this book and read it right away. And thank you, everyone in the audience, and thank you for the great questions.
Thank you.
Take care. I'd clap.
Bye.
The audience would clap, but it's hard to do online. Thank you.
Bye. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.